We are Norway, even though we're not an EU member, as everyone knows, we are playing very close with the European Commission because we want to contribute with our capabilities. I mentioned the Arctic Surveillance Program and also the Arctic Satellite Broadband mission, and there will be other capabilities. How can that play in as a positive contribution both into the EU and the European Commission programs, but also into NATO? But in the NATO discussion, the military capability of NATO is depending on the military capability and the sum of capability of all of individual NATO countries.
Hey Space Watchers, and welcome to another episode of Space Café Radio, to our special series of reflections on 2025. 2025 was not just another year in space. It was a year where many long-standing assumptions finally broke down. Assumptions about stability, about predictability. Space clearly moved from a supporting role into the center of security and defense thinking. New space strategies emerged across Europe and the United States. And Germany announced a 35 billion euro for space defense and security. ESA entered a new phase with a 22.3 billion euro budget, and space threats, from interference to resilience and deterrence, became impossible to ignore. And perhaps most importantly, geography matters again. The High North, the Arctic and the Nordic regions are no longer peripheral in space security discussions. They are central. Space is critical for situational awareness, deterrence, communication, and alliance coherence in this region. And that brings NATO, transatlantic cooperation, and bilateral partnerships firmly into the picture. In this series, we are not chasing headlines. We are asking what really changed in 2025, what these decisions mean in practice, and what the real tests will be in 2026. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Christian Hauglie-Hanssen, the CEO of the Norwegian Space Agency. And with him, we will look at space threats from a Nordic perspective, Norway's space relationship with the United States, NATO's first thinking in space, and how European investment signals from Berlin to ESA are viewed in the High North. So let's take a step back, reflect on 2025, and look forward to what lies ahead. Welcome to Space Café Radio, Christian. How are you doing today?
Hi, Torsten, and thank you for inviting me on the show again. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Like you said, it's a very busy year, and I think that the topics that you're outlining are very essential to what we also will talk about in the next year, in 2026. So I'm doing fine, and I'm looking forward to Christmas, as we all are.
Okay, then let's try to go through these very complex topics, but try to frame it in a way that we can process that within the next half an hour. So, from a Norwegian perspective, did 2025 change how space threats are perceived in the Nordic region?
I think the answer to that is also quite complex because you really have to define what are you talking about when you're talking about space threats. The most obvious ones are what you can see in the press with anti-satellite weapons and shooting at satellites and creating space debris, all of which are concrete threats. At the same time, we're seeing that probably all nations accept that this is in the end not a very good idea because the low Earth orbits are common domain and so forth. But space threats are so many other things. Can they be hacked? In the scenario of cybersecurity, what is the availability in terms of access through launch to space? And as you say, in the Nordic region, how does that affect us? Norway is a country very much reliant on space capabilities through communication, navigation in the Arctic waters, and our operations in the oil and gas sector at Svalbard, civilian transportation along the coast and everything. Norway is a country with very broad use of space services. And in that sense, I think that space threats, one of the biggest things is probably that we're getting now political attention to this. We're seeing more and more, and that's part of our job at the Norwegian Space Agency, is to communicate with the politicians to make them understand how does this affect this? Because a lot of the space services, they're implicit in the daily life, but they may not be so visible. So that was probably one of the things that characterizes 2025 is the understanding that space threats is a thing, and it has to be tied into our national interest, but also our relation to Europe, the European Union, and as you mentioned initially, also our relationship to the United States, NATO, and other NATO countries.
No, I get your point, and I can sense that after many years of hard work in the industry, So finally, we reached the politicians and they're using space also for their argumentations. And what we thought, what would be an immediate thing after the Russian invasion into the Ukraine 3 years ago or almost 4 years ago, it still took a while. But this entire narrative changed now, finally, in my opinion. And we have seen the Norwegian minister for something in space. You're not having that as a separate ministry, but showing her presence at the ESA ministerial in Bremen 3 weeks ago. And I think that was a great sign.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing how this is changing, because when we're looking at the strategic element of this, the previous Norwegian space strategy that was finalized in 2013, there was a lot of talk about the industrial capability, the technology development, and national services, which is generic for any spacefaring nation. That this is really the key motivation. At the same time, when the follow-up space strategy came in 2019, the elements of secure and robust infrastructure and how this applies to national security and national defense became more apparent. And we also saw contribution from our Ministry of Defense and our armed forces into this strategy. When you mentioned our Minister of Trade and Industry, Cecilie Myrseth, we're seeing a closer dialogue also with the national security, with the Ministry of Defense, in terms of what is the next step. When we met at the previous conference in Oslo, the spaceport, she was there and she announced this, that we will now work on finalizing the next update of the national space strategy. And no secret, obviously, national security issues, how this points to Norway's role towards other countries tied to the national security element, will become very prominent. I really think that getting political attention, not only in our own ministry, but also across the sector, the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Climate and Environment, where we've had dialogue for more than a decade on space issues, this is all coming together and is part of our job here at the agency.
Your recent statement fits finally into my next question, and that's how central is space to deterrence, what we haven't spoken so far, and security in the high north today?
For me, it's probably easier to comment on the security element. Deterrence has a more military character. I will get back to that a little bit later, how we are in dialogue with our armed forces and our Ministry of Defense. But in terms of security, I think this can be tied to several things. First of all, that all the traffic, if we start with our maritime domain, which is very central to the type of services we're working on, is becoming more digital, and it's also becoming more susceptible in terms of cyber attacks and stability in how to operate this. And I think it's important to say that space is sometimes unique, but very often it's supplemental to other types of infrastructure. When we're talking to our police, our mapping authorities, and all types of different agencies working on this and that, many of them have ground-based services or infrastructure, and where space can become an important supplement. But sometimes when you get really far into the high north and into the Arctic, there is no infrastructure. And we really have to rely solely on this, as we've done in many ways for a couple of decades, but it's becoming more and more prominent that we have to rely on this. And this is specific to Norway. We have the Arctic Satellite Broadband mission that was launched a little more than a year ago. This is the first time that you have satellites going in high elliptical orbit over the North Pole, providing broadband communication in that region. This is a project that has been realized between Norway and the US Space Force, and also Viasat in terms of providing civil communication as well. So it's both Norwegian military, it's US Space Force, and its civilian capabilities in terms of payloads. So you can support many different actors in the high north. And that is really central to how you interpret the element of security, because security, you can talk about national security, but you can also talk about maritime security and all those things. And I think that in combination with navigation, which is, of course, exceedingly important with both the GPS, but also now Galileo and the EGNOS services that are being adopted to being fully operational in the high north, extending the reach of using satellite navigation. Yes, space is increasingly important for the security in the high north today. In terms of deterrence, let's say from a civilian perspective, we're talking about now more low Earth orbit systems with larger constellation. This is in order to create robustness, both in terms of communication and in the EU frame, we're talking about the LEO PNT, position, navigation, and time, based on a fleet or a constellation of smaller satellites. In that, you may say that there is a deterrence because these systems are designed to be harder to be knocked out. It's really hard to take out one satellite. They could always be replenished. And I think that in order for the military forces, national security, the element of deterrence can be strengthened by having these large constellations in low Earth orbit. At least that is one element.
I want to come back to something you just mentioned. You just used the word civilian, and the Norwegian Space Agency is a civilian agency, like most space agencies are. But as just mentioned, space security and defense are now unavoidable. So how much is NOSA's work today defense related?
Actually, if you're talking about defense in the civil military domain, well, you can actually reach back more than 20 years ago. The very, very close cooperation between the Norwegian Space Agency, the National Defense Research Establishment, FFI, and the Civil Coastal Authority, that is where the idea of a civil military maritime domain, maritime awareness satellite became rooted through the AISat-1 that was launched in 2010. Already at that time, we were working very close with the National Defense Lab. So this has developed over time. Now, what we established in cooperation with the armed forces and under an agreement with the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Trade Industry, is this Arctic surveillance program that we established 2 years ago. It was on our initiative because the idea was we need to consolidate the effort that we're now putting into the investment through ESA, through our national programs, what the armed forces are doing, into how can we, in the best possible way, use these small but very powerful and efficient satellites in order to strengthen, in general, maritime security. Along that discussion, we have established a joint program office for doing this, pointing forward in terms of how we're going to utilize this. Not only, well, we're starting with maritime surveillance, but we're also looking at space situational awareness, looking up, and we're seeing how we can build on this. We took the discussion with both ministries in how that would affect the role of the space agency. So actually now we have an updated mandate from our ministry saying that we are also in charge of civil military space coordination from the civilian perspective. And it's a pragmatic approach, and it's very powerful actually, because the armed forces have their things, no doubt about that. But they have a very clear vision that they want to engage in the civilian sector in order to utilize, avoid duplication, make use of the excellent technology that was developed on the civilian sector. And that is what is behind the civil military approach that we have now established through this national program called NORCAP. And I can get a little bit back to that.
Just for clarification, you as head of the agency, you have one boss in the Ministry of Trade, right?
That's right.
But you just described, I would summarize it as dual use capabilities. So civil and military use. Is that today shifting also to hard military, where, like for the DLR, for instance, research and development in armament is done in the German Aerospace Center in parts? If I would rephrase it, where do you clearly draw a line where you can't step over?
As I said, the armed forces, the MOD, they have their traditional ways of cooperating with NATO partners. With the key partners in Europe, as you mentioned, we have very close cooperation with the German armed forces, now with the UK and others, of course, France. Right now we have acquisition going on for new submarines, for new frigates, and this system of system approach where also space capabilities comes in, that is also a natural development. So I think it's fair to say that we have an agreement with the way we cooperate with the armed forces. They have their things, and some of that is classified. They will not talk about it, and I can't talk about it. But then they will approach us in where they see that this can actually fulfill their little bit more softer side. But when you look at all of this, this becomes, again, a particular piece of, say, Earth observation data, depending on, is it real time? What is the resolution? What is the geolocation accuracy? There's obvious military applications for this. I think that's probably the overall more generalized statement on how this can be worked. That satellite data that we can provide through the space agency in our more civilian-oriented programs, you can have an interface where also the military can have certain type of use of these data.
Does the military has their own space corps? I don't want to call it space command, but a group of people that are taking care about the military space applications?
In the armed forces, they have a space commander, which is matching now the space commanders in other NATO countries. And I think most of the NATO countries, at least that have their own space capabilities, they will have their own space commander in order to utilize that. And especially out of a perspective of joint operations, I really think you can't get past it, because you really have to, as part of a vertical stemming from submarine sensors to sensors in orbit, you really have to look at how can you make the best use of that.
So let's widen the focus a bit on the international sphere. from a NATO first perspective, so how does Norway's space cooperation translate into collective defense?
A NATO perspective is one thing. The other thing is, in general, how it translates into collective defense. And I really think that, especially again, since we're a civil space agency, I really think that we also need to discuss this into an European EU perspective, because we are seeing, and that's the ongoing debate, what looking forward will be the role of the NATO countries and NATO as an organization, and what would be the role of the EU and the European Commission. I really think we start looking into the EU space law, which is on the table. It will be revised for sure, but it is looking at how can we, based on the civilian programs and the great success of the Copernicus, on the Galileo EGNOS, and how can we build this into a system of systems that both serves the need of Europe as a whole. And we are Norway, even though we're not an EU member, as everyone knows, we are playing very close with the European Commission, because we think that we want to contribute with our capabilities from the High North. I mentioned the Arctic Surveillance Program and also the Arctic Satellite Broadband mission, and there will be also other capabilities. How can that play in as a positive contribution, both into the EU and the European Commission programs, but also into NATO? But in the NATO discussion, and this is something that we also discussed extensively in ESA, is how does this relate to NATO as a military organization? Because NATO is a construct like consisting of a number of countries, and the military capability of NATO is depending on the military capability and the sum of capability of all of individual NATO countries. This is somewhat different than what we're trying to achieve through the EU space programs, where you're talking about more a federated system operating on behalf of everyone, of the 27 EU members and other associate members like Norway and others, maybe Canada. And then how could that be matched with NATO? I think it's a very interesting discussion, because now you have how much money are you going to put into NATO? And now it's a guiding on 5%, which is a huge expansion from the previous 2% that really none of the NATO countries, except for a handful, were actually able to fulfill. Now, because of the whole development, this pressure that we're seeing from the US is, in my opinion, I think, and it's totally legitimate, because it's a burden sharing issue, right? Mm-hmm. So we really need to see how will what we're doing through the collectively in Europe, how can that play into also NATO capability? But I don't think it's a given answer to that, because as you mentioned initially, you said Germany now announced their 35 billion euros in strengthening their own space capability, also on the defense side. This is a huge shift. And you saw how that affected the ministerial conference, no doubt, because people do not want to fall behind. And I think the statement from Germany is totally in line with what they've gone public with in terms of how they will invest in space. That some of it will be through the EU, but some will be on a national basis. And I really think that's the way it will have to be, both in terms of NATO, but also in terms of the EU and other, say, national space programs in Europe. That was a long answer, but I really think it's a very interesting topic to discuss.
Absolutely. And I know with all of these topics, we can go much deeper into it. So you spoke about the system of systems approach, and that was something that ESA sold the ERS, the European Resilience from Space for. Let's talk about the ESA Ministerial 25 that just concluded. So what was Norway's most important contribution, and politically or programmatically? And what role does the new Space Center in Tromsø play in that, what you announced during the event?
Okay. So you're covering a lot of things, and I'll try to answer them one at a time. But first of all, if you look at the contribution of Norway to ESA, what we did in this ministerial really was a follow-up to what we did also in CM22 3 years ago. It's been my personal view and also the position of the space agency that in the position that we have, and you're really back to your first question, how does this play out in the High North? Norway has certain capabilities. We also have certain needs, which means that can justify a particular national space program development. And this is what we started to do. Now, the point is that ESA is at the core of our space activities. It's been since 1987. We're seeing that this is plowing the way to also our engagement to the next phase of the EU space programs. But we need to have a balance. And this is a very important discussion for us. The balance needs to be between what we're putting money into ESA, into our engagement in the EU space programs, but also what we're doing on national level. So in this ministerial, it reflected on next year's space budget from the minister that we will continue to play on ESA. We're doing our declarations. At the same time, we have established a national space program, NORCAP. What is NORCAP? NORCAP is national money that will be partly supplemental to what we're doing in ESA. The logic being that the technology development in ESA is great, and that's what we've been pursuing now for 4 decades, but we are seeing for some particular national needs, we will have to do this on a national level. We already started doing that in 22, and we will continue to do this. So that is really the construct. To your next question, how did that form our declarations? We all have heard, at least anyone interested in your podcast, have heard about the European Launcher Challenge, because in terms of access to space, you're back 2 years into the famous Seville resolution. How would the political will in Europe pave the way forward in terms of breaking up monopoly and creating commercialization and competitiveness in Europe? This year, with Andøya coming up, we're looking at the second launch from ESA, from the Spectrum, just in a few weeks' time. This is the way forward where Norway would like to put money into what can accelerate the commercialization of European launch capability. This is very important, and Andøya and jointly with ISAR will be a key player on this. And I've said this many times before, I will continue to root for anyone who wants to go commercial on this. Not everyone can win, but the European Launcher Challenge, the way it has been formulated, will be a means of funding in order to try to step up and accelerate this. And it's still sort of an experiment in terms of how to develop commercial space services. And it cannot continue forever, but it will make the new competitors, Rocket Factory, Augsburg, and Orbex, and ISAR, and all of those being capable of entering into the market. So it's both a strategic view, the mix national ESA EU, but also the commercialization going forward. The other element is we're continuing on Earth observation, we're continuing on specific needs on satellite navigation and so forth. So that's the mix of our declaration. But European Launcher Challenge was high on the list this time, and for political reasons as well.
And I just looked up that our last conversation that we had in a podcast was before the 2022 ESA Ministerial, because I remembered that we were not sure in which area what will play out in at the end. You owe me still one answer on the Tromsø Center. So what is behind that?
In Tromsø, we have, first of all, it's a cluster of Arctic Science, the University of Tromsø, the Norwegian Polar Institute. We have KSAT with their capability on polar satellite services. We have Svalbard, we have Andøya, and all those things. So this is high on the political agenda because it's a local powerhouse in terms of how to serve the Arctic and those things. We established a year and a half ago the ESA Phi Lab, which is now an entity. It's funded for 4 years. It was one of the first Phi Labs in ESA in order to see how can we use this in terms of creating commercial services based on Earth observation and other type of space-based services. Now, the idea of an ESA Arctic Center is a much broader approach. The whole idea is with the needs of ESA also to be a player in the Arctic and the high north, will various type of capabilities in line with those that I mentioned before. How can this be a collective approach in order to strengthen that part of the space sector? This will not be obviously a Norway only, but it will be on a Nordic platform and others that are interested in the Arctic and capabilities that serves the need of those nations. What we've done is we have very close dialogue with ESA on this. We're establishing a joint project team. We have a very aggressive timeline. And what we're doing now is putting together the foundation for what such an ESA Arctic Center can be. And then based on that, we will take a decision how to move forward.
Okay. It's more a study of a center than really build it and open it.
We have to start with something. And the letter of intent signed between our minister and the ESA Director General, Joseph Aschbacher, was exactly that, to say, okay, now we will do the investigation. How can this be materialized into something real? And then the next step will be, okay, when that is to a satisfactory level, that's when we'll put other resources into going the next step. But this is something that we'll have to work with over time. It's a sensible way to do it.
What is the timeline for the first step now?
First of all, we will use the next year in order to dig into the material. We will establish a project team that is going on as we speak and really drill down into what type of capabilities are we talking about. And remember, this has happened really fast, and we've had a very positive response from political level in Norway, but also from ESA. And that's where we need to start working on it. If you're looking at this as any other endeavor, we'll need type of financing, and we might look at the CM28. Most likely we will step up before that, but I'm personally looking at a staged introduction somehow, but we'll lay out a plan, and then we'll get the cooperation going with the other Nordic countries and others who may be relevant for interest, and we'll form it from there.
Thanks for this clarification. Germany, as mentioned earlier, announced the 35 billion for space defense, including a new space security and safety strategy, which haven't been seen before. How are these signals perceived from Oslo?
I think it really underpins the discussion, the strategic discussion that is going on in general in Europe. And you saw Germany announce the 35 billion, but also President Macron came with his statement on a French space strategy. Norwegian minister saying we're doing an upgrade of our space strategy. And I think that the common element of this is that we need to see how space can play both into the daily lives, the daily needs and services, but also on upgrading the capabilities of our armed forces. That really is the way I perceive it, is that it's done in order to create a balance between what we can do through, say, a federated system like the ERS or the Earth Observation Government System and the secure connectivity, which is where the ambition is to do a federated system. The interesting thing is how the European Commission is also looking at these contributing missions, which are already part of the Copernicus program, looking at how can either commercial or national capability play in as a supplement to what was being done centrally in the European Commission. I think this is a good way to go forward. The idea is not something new. The GovSatcom initiative is close to 10 years old, I think. That's one of the first things I was talking about when I was in the agency. And the idea here is pooling and sharing. That is a good idea. If you want to avoid duplication, you want to also acknowledge the needs of the individual country, like Germany, like France, like Norway, like Italy. How are they building things that can serve their own purpose at the same time it can contribute into a more overall common good? I think that's the right way to do it. And there's a lot of work to make this work the right way.
Let's look ahead into 2026 and coming back to Norwegian point of view. What will be the key space security challenge for Norway and its partners in the next year?
I will try to tie that into what you just said, because I really think the question, how are you going to spend all this money, is very important. My background, I have almost 30 years in industry, space and defense, and ramping up capability is very challenging. It doesn't happen overnight. And so the question that can be raised towards the German approach can also be raised towards the European Commission. They're talking about also a 5-fold increase of their space program. And how are you going to ramp this up? It has to be meaningful. You have to have a reliable production line with logistics and everything in order to realize this. And I think that both for Norway, you're asking how will 2026 be affected in this from a security challenge perspective, really how to make a sensible plan forward in terms of ramping up capability and how are you going to use this? And very important questions to be raised. And I was at an EU Space Resilience conference where this was raised. You can have the ambition of a system of systems all you want, but getting these to play together is very challenging. Even, say, a sensor fusion that, okay, you have data from this source, from that source, and from another source is key in order to establish robust military capability. So I think that when you're asking the question, what will be the key space security challenge for Norway and its partners, that the formulation of the question is the right one, because you cannot isolate it. You have to take care of how will you facilitate for your own means, again, referring to Germany and France and its partners. How are you going to play this together? So I think getting a good plan in order how you will actually do this as a construct is both important, but it's also very challenging, because you need an industrial setup. If the European Commission wants to offload this into industry in order to create the proper commercialization, they also need competition. You saw in secure connectivity, IRIS² that they ended up with only one consortium bidding. And that in itself is a challenge. It's multifaceted. You need to build capability. That will take time. It really takes time. You need to have a good balance between national, central, and common programs. And then you need to have a viable planning for the capabilities that you're actually trying to achieve. I think that going forward, 2026 will be characterized by a lot of strategic work. At the end of the year, we had a summary of all the different activities that we're looking at. And these are both individual, but are also tied together. So there's a lot of strategy work that will be required. And I think that goes for any nation that wants to do this, and also jointly what we're going to do jointly with other European partners and partners in NATO.
Great. Christian, thank you very much for this review of 2025. I wish you and the agency all the best for 2026, and I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Torsten, and a very Merry Christmas to you too and the SpaceWatch.Global team. So thank you very much.
If you like these or other episodes of Space Café Radio, leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform. It is the currency of today. And if you want to stay on the pulse of the space industry, please visit our website at www.SpaceWatch.Global and subscribe to our newsletters. And of course, don't forget to become a Space Watcher. I'm Torsten Kriening, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, your independent perspective on space.